And this particular shir is dedicated anonymously for the refuah shalema of Evelina Bat Galina. May she have a refuah shalema b'toch shar cholei Yisrael. Again, I apologize for last week. I gave notice very, very late. I was actually prepared to go in spite of a very bad cold. My wife forbade me to go. And although I initially opposed her, as I started to walk out of the apartment, I realized that her judgment was more correct, as is usually the case. So I apologize for people who were here. It's interesting. As I get older, I find that recovery time seems to be much longer. Everything is slower. But B'ezras Hashem, I should also have a refuah shlema. We were looking at the famous letter to Ovadia the Ger, and I had mentioned there were three questions. Question number one was he was told that as a Ger, he should not say Elokei Avoseinu, that God is the God of our forefathers, because Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov were not his forefathers, and the Rambam, as we went through it at length, takes the position that this is a matter of spiritual lineage. It is not a matter of biological descent. And if one embraces the path of Avraham, then one is a child of Avraham. The third question was whether Islam is technically considered to be idolatry. Now, this is a very, very important question. It's even important today because obviously a Jew cannot be a Muslim. That's not the question. The question is, can a Goy be a Muslim? Because under the 7 commandments of Noach, one of the prohibitions is the issur of idolatry. So as a result, even if one is otherwise a righteous person, if something is technically avodah zarah, it would be prohibited under the Noachide law for even a non-Jew to practice it. And from the perspective of halacha, therefore, although we don't follow this halacha because we're not in charge, an oved avodah zarah, one who practices idolatry, is not allowed to have residence in the land of Israel. Meaning a non-Jew can live in Eretz Yisrael only if they renounce idolatry and they adopt monotheism. So that would be, of course, that would kind of lead us, if you took the position that it was avodah zarah, this would lead us to kind of the Meir Kahana solution to our problem, and that is expulsion, although for a different reason than he suggested. Now, the Rambam, however, did come out, you'll recall, that Islam, again, he had all sorts of problems with Islam. He considered Muhammad to be crazy and destructive and evil in many, many ways. But he did say the one thing they have in their favor is it is a monotheistic religion. It is not halachically avodah zarah, as opposed to Christianity, which the Rambam did believe was a pagan religion. I had mentioned last week, 2 weeks ago rather, that Rabbeinu Tam actually argues even with that. Rabbeinu Tam, who lived in Catholic France, takes the position that even Christianity or Catholicism, Trinitarian Catholicism, was ultimately a monotheistic religion. So that's a huge machlokas that has repercussions even today. Now, the second question, the middle question, which I didn't address, and I'm actually not going to address now, I do want to devote maybe a much longer share on this, but I do want to get ahead to a different letter, is the issue of fatalism. Ovadia Hager says he was taught by his rabbis, and he never mentions who his rabbis are, that since everything is determined by God, it kind of makes no difference what you do in life other than your decision to keep the commandments or not keep the commandments. This is the famous statement, Hakol bidei shamayim, everything is in the hands of heaven, chutz meyirat shamayim, except for your decision to serve God. So whether I do a mitzvah or do an aveira, that's up to me. But everything else, rich, poor, healthy, sick, who will you marry? This rabbi said, everything is decided by God, and your decisions have no impact on the outcome. Which means, if you are supposed to die on a certain day and a certain time, you will die whether you're sitting at your dining room table or whether you cross against the light, or whether you decide to take a pleasure trip to Gaza. And this is a very fatalistic approach in which, other than mitzvot and averot, where of course you have free will, all outcomes are absolutely predetermined, and human decision-making has no impact on whatever the result is going to be. As you might expect, the Rambam, as a rationalist, totally rejects that idea, and the Rambam makes the point that it is certainly the case that human decisions have consequences that would otherwise not take place had you not made certain decisions. So, yes, God may decree in heaven who you're going to marry, but you can marry somebody else. A person puts himself in a dangerous situation. A person makes irresponsible decisions. The Rambam says the negative consequences that ensue are not foregone conclusions that would have happened anyway. They happen because you made certain decisions. So the Rambam essentially, just as a matter of interpretation, is explaining the phrase, everything is in the hands of heaven except for the fear of God. Fear of God is lav dafka, but it means all decisions that human beings make in their lives will set off a series of consequences, and those consequences might not have occurred had you not made certain decisions. So the Rambam is essentially advocating or articulating what we might call an ethic of responsibility, as opposed to fatalism. And he's very critical of the rabbi for espousing fatalism. And although he does not point it out in this letter, but in reality, this was a common thread in the Islamic philosophy of the time, in which the notion was that your decisions affect nothing at all, because everything will either happen or not happen in accordance with God's ultimate will. And the Rambam rejects that concept of fatalism. Now, that is a huge topic, and I do want to spend much more time on it, but not today. I will, God willing, we'll come back and revisit it. But I want to go on to a next letter. But at the end of the letter to Rabbi Hager, the Rambam has words which you might call of great tenderness, because Obadiah's final complaint was that when I ask my rabbi questions, he calls me ignorant, or he even says, you come from non-Jewish origin, so you don't understand things. And the Rambam does have a certain outrage for that type of disparagement. And he talks about how beloved a person is who voluntarily embraces the yoke of the mitzvos and the desire to be part of the Jewish people who are so oppressed and so abused. And yet out of your love of God and your love of OUisrael, you have decided to connect. How dare a person disparage you, where the Torah more than 30 times warns us to be solicitous and respectful to the ger. In fact, the Rambam is a little sarcastic. He says, instead of this rabbi wondering if Islam is avodah zarah, he ought to examine whether his behavior is idolatrous, because it is going against the mitzvot of the Torah. So the next letter I want to read can almost be seen as a little bit of a complementary type of letter to this. And this is a letter, a personal letter, that the Rambam wrote to a man in Baghdad, so from Cairo to Baghdad, distance, Yoseph Iban Jabar. Yoseph Iban Jabar. Yoseph Iban Jabar is otherwise unknown to history, except for this single letter that the Rambam wrote. And my guess is that when Yoseph Iban Jabar got that letter, it was the thrill of his life. I don't know if he even expected it. Yoseph Iban Jabar was an unlearned Jew who did not even understand Lashon HaKodesh. He could read Hebrew, like he davened, but he didn't understand the Hebrew language. But he had a very great love for the learning of Torah. And, remember the Rambam's commentary to the Mishnah was written in Arabic, unlike the Mishnah Torah, which was written in Mishnaic Hebrew. So Yoseph Iban Jabar spent all of his time studying the commentary of the Rambam on the Mishnah in Arabic, because he didn't understand Hebrew. But he wanted to learn Torah as much as he could. And he spent many, many hours immersed in this. So he sent a letter to the Rambam. And also Baghdad, Baghdad had a very large yeshiva. And the Rosh Yeshiva of the Baghdad yeshiva This is not a Gaon anymore. This is after the period of the Gaonim. But this Rosh Yeshiva had many, many disagreements with these decisions of the Rambam and would often disparage the Rambam. And Rav Yoseph Iban Jabar, who learned so much from the Rambam, at least secondhand, was very indignant for the kavod of the Rambam, and he wanted to kind of answer all of the, he was not a learned Jew, but he wanted to answer all of these objections. So we asked the Rambam, can you answer all of these questions that they're raising against you so I can stand up in your defense? You know, I can't tell, but it reminds me, I have this memory as a child that when I was growing up in Connecticut, so we had a very, very learned rabbi for a short while, very, very learned, big Talmid Chacham, who had an enormous impact on me and many of the children. But some of the adults didn't like him because maybe he was too frum or too learned or too, whatever it would be. So they used to undermine him in various ways. So I remember a very, very fine, simple, unlearned Jew, a big, burly guy, who was always, if somebody said something against the rabbi, like he would punch the guy out. He was like a defender. So I remember, I must have been maybe 11 years old. I was at Shalosh Shudas in Shul, Shabbos afternoon. And the rabbi's drasha was going long. He did not always pay attention to the clock. He was a very learned, actually a very great person. And finally, one of these antagonistic balabatim bangs on the table and says, enough already, time for Maariv. And the rabbi said, I'm sorry that I'm committing the great avera of being mechalel chol, of desecrating chol. Okay, Beseder, that was, when I was growing up, those types of fights were unfortunately relatively common. But then, as we get up for Maariv, right after Baruch, all of a sudden I hear this big guy, good-hearted neshama, that he has the other guy against the wall, and he says, you say another thing against our rabbi, I'm going to punch you out. So the good heart of the person who may not have the knowledge but wants to defend Kavod Torah. I get the impression, although I have no idea, that Yoseph Iban Jabar had that same type of indignation. He says, he's hearing the Rambam being insulted. He's going to stand up and do something about it. But he doesn't know what to say. So he says to the Rambam, hey, tell me the answers so I can stand up against this Baghdad Rosh Yeshiva, who himself was considered to be a Gadol. So the letter to Yoseph Iban Jabar, and again, as I say, people were surprised. People in Baghdad were very surprised that the Rambam wrote, the Rambam already was meforsam as the greatest of the greatest, that the Rambam would write a letter to an Am Haaretz. But the letter has three parts, and all three parts are very, very interesting. The letter was in Arabic, translated into Hebrew later. Part one is, the Rambam says, and these are very beautiful words, he says, you call yourself an Am Haaretz, you call yourself an ignoramus. He says, you're not an Am Haaretz, you are a lover of Torah. And a person who tries to learn Torah, even if it's one Mishnah or one Halacha, is not an ignorant man. He is a person who is seeking a connection to God. And he made the point, and it makes no difference if it's in Hebrew or Aramaic or Arabic or any other language. He points out, halachically, you can even say Shema in other languages or Shemona Esrei in other languages. Kal v'chomer learning. So today, if you're learning a Gemara from Art Scroll, that's okay, right? You're learning. The Rambam says it's perfectly fine. Now, Rabbi Yoseph Iban Jabar asked the Rambam, though, well, I can't learn your Mishnah Torah because I don't understand Hebrew. Could you get someone to do an Arabic translation of the Mishnah Torah? So on this, the Rambam says, I don't want to do that, he says. First of all, even my Arabic works, I want them to be basically read in Hebrew eventually. So I'm not going to translate the Mishnah Torah into Arabic. But he tells Rabbi Yoseph Iban Jabar, the Hebrew is pretty easy. And you can just get used to it after a while. And once you know one book, you'll be able to read all the other books. It's all going to come. Don't give up. And then the Rambam reminds him of Rabbi Akiva, the late starters, the people who didn't begin learning Torah until they were advanced age, and they became very, very great. He says, don't sell yourself short. Al tizalzel biatzmecha. Do not cheapen yourself. Do not denigrate yourself. You're not an Amoritz. You're a Lomei Torah, and the Rambam says, I consider you my Talmud, my disciple. You are as close to me as any of my Talmidim. Move this? So, as I say, these are very tender words. Now, someone pointed out that if you go back to the Rambam's letter on resurrection, the Rambam was very, 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 and we've encountered this before, was very harsh against his critics. He called them ignorant and stupid and foolish. And here we kind of have a different aspect of it. But part of it is, the Rambam was very, very great. But the Rambam was also a human being. And if somebody is calling you a heretic, an apikoros, a danger to Klal Yisrael, understandably, you get a little upset. So the Rambam had his moments of getting upset. I don't necessarily consider that to be a tremendous moral failure. But I think when we look at the letters of Ovadia Hager and the letter to Yoseph Iban Jabar, I think we see a different side, a certain tenderness, a certain compassion, a certain understanding that not everybody is necessarily going to be so learned or so knowledgeable. But if they're trying to serve God, they're worthy of encouragement, and they're worthy of strength, and they're worthy of building them up instead of tearing them down. In fact, it's interesting that, all of you know about the Cairo Geniza, the very, very famous Geniza in Cairo that's still being mined for its inexhaustible riches, in which 1,000 years of different documents were put there, svarim and manuscripts and letters. So, in fact, the Cairo Geniza is actually the source of a number of the letters of the Rambam. A number of these letters are actually from the Cairo Geniza, they were retrieved from the Cairo Geniza itself. So, I'm not sure why every single letter was put in Geniza. Not all the letters are holy. There's a lot of secular documents in the Cairo Geniza as well, business documents and the like. So I'm not sure, maybe because of Baruch Hashem or something like that. But in the Cairo Geniza, there's a letter that is not included as a Rambam letter. It's not a Rambam's letter, but it's a letter of a man describing his visit to the Rambam. He had traveled from another country to visit the Rambam, and he brought along his 6-year-old son. And he wrote a letter to his family describing what it was like to visit the Rambam. So he says he comes to the Rambam on Shabbos, and the Rambam's only son, Rav Avram ben Rambam, was helping his father, and Rav Avram ben Rambam whispered to the man, my father loves when children call him Saba. So ask your son to call him Saba. My father will really love that. And the man writes in his letter that my son called the Rambam Saba, and the Rambam pinched his cheek and gave him a kiss, and then went to another room to bring him some lemon candy and the like. So, there was a different side. The Rambam was not just a computer. We look at the Rambam sometimes as just super rational, which of course he was. He was rationalist in a way that we're not even used to today in our more mystical society. But within that rationalism was a great deal of care and compassion and responsibility. So that comes across, I think, in the first part of the letter to Yoseph Iban Jabar, encouraging him in his learning. But you see how he's moving in two directions. On one hand, he tells him, it makes no difference what language you learn Torah in. Any language is great. The main thing is to learn. But then he says, on the other hand, maybe you ought to try to learn Hebrew. At the same time, he's pushing him to challenge himself a little bit. And he says, the Mishnah Torah, the Hebrew is not so hard. You'll get used to it, and after a while, you'll then be able to learn the Mishnah Torah in the original. Now, the second part of the letter, which is the longest part of the letter, I won't go into all the details, are some specific Halakhic rulings that the rabbinate and the Rosh Hashiva of Baghdad said were totally incorrect. And Rav Yoseph Iban Jabar enumerates some of these hotly debated questions, and the Rambam gives some short answers. I'll just mention them relatively quickly because the truth of the matter is the Rambam's letter also is relatively brief on the halachic points because, after all, Yoseph Iban Jabar wouldn't necessarily understand all of the details, halachic argumentation, so the Rambam kind of addresses it in bullet points, as we would call it today. The first is the resuscitation of the old canard that the Rambam did not believe in physical resurrection of the dead. That the Rambam believes that the only reward is the survival of the soul in Olam Haba. And the Rosh Yeshiva of Baghdad said this is apicorsis, this is kafira, this is heresy, because physical resurrection is a fundamental belief of the Torah. The Rambam simply says, don't worry about it. The people who claim I don't believe in physical resurrection are either intentionally distorting my position or they're just foolish and they don't understand. And the Rambam says, I've already written a very long essay articulating my position, and that, of course, is the letter on resurrection that we looked at. I'm not going to repeat or review all of that, other than I will restate what I said, and that is the Rambam does indeed give lip service to physical resurrection 100%, but he seems to relegate it into a relative status of insignificance, meaning he's kind of stuck with it, so he cannot deny it and does not deny it, but he does not see it as that important in the ultimate plan of Acharit Hayamim, where the only thing that is eternal is Olam Haba. So that's point number one. Then point number two, again, these are bullet points, is that the Rambam says in Hilchos Malachim, in the Mishnah Torah, which has already been written, right? Because a lot of these criticisms are on the Mishnah Torah, that now this is a bit of a subtle point, and it's not so easy to even understand what's at stake here. But the Rambam made the point that the reason the Jewish people do anything is only because of the mitzvos that Hashem gave Moshe at Har Sinai. So the example would be circumcision. There are at least two mitzvos that God gave to the Jewish people, or the Avos at least, before Matan Torah. Hashem gave Avraham the commandments of Bris Milah, and with Yaakov Avinu, it's a little ambiguous. If you remember, Yaakov, when he comes back after his years with Lavan, so Yaakov fights with the angel of Esav all night, and towards the dawn, the angel smites him on the thigh, and Yaakov is limping because the thigh got dislocated. So the Torah says, Al Kain lo yochlu b'nei Yisrael es gid hanosheh. To commemorate Yaakov's encounter with the angel, where the thigh and the sciatic nerve got dislocated, we do not eat the sciatic nerve ad hayom hazeh, to this very day. And basically that actually, as a practical matter, that actually means the sciatic nerve is a huge nerve with many, many branches. And as a result, to do nikur, to remove all parts of the sciatic nerve, is a very, very difficult process. Because of this, the Ashkenazic custom for hundreds of years has been that we simply sell the hindquarters of the animal, which contains the sciatic nerve, to non-Jews, because that's why sirloin steak or various cuts, filet mignon even, you normally cannot get it except by special order. Special order, they can do it, but commercially it's not feasible. Sfardim do practice what is called nikur achurayim. Nikur achurayim is removing the gid hanosheh from the back half of the animal. Now, let me ask you this. We have these two commandments in Genesis. One is Bris Milah, given to Avram. One is Gid HaNasheh. But Gid HaNasheh is actually a little ambiguous, Because the Chumash does not say that God commanded Yaakov not to eat the Gid on Hashem. The phrase Al Kain could have been a Mosaic edition, Al Pi Hashem, that at the time of Matan Torah, God said, I am commanding you not to eat the Gid on Hashem because of the story of Yaakov. In other words, if we ask, when did we get the commandment of Gid on Hashem? There actually is no hechrech that we got the mitzvah of Gid on Hashem from the time of Yaakov. Rather, at the time of Matan Torah, Hashem is telling Bnei Yisrael, because of that story, thou shalt not eat Gid on Hashem. So the Rambam makes the point that Gid on Hashem, Al Kain lo yochlu Bnei Yisrael, is not referring to a tzivoy at the time of Yaakov. It is simply a tzivoy at the time of Matan Torah that was inserted in the story of Yaakov to give us that explanation. Now, textually, that is actually a completely legitimate explanation. But the problem is the Rambam applies it even to circumcision. The Rambam says, the reason we do Brit Milah is not because Avraham did a Brit Milah. We do Brit Milah because Moshe Rabbeinu communicated to us, Al Pi Hashem, the story of Avraham Avinu and the Brit Milah, but the Mechayev, the obligation of doing all mitzvot, stems from the Sinaitic revelation and not from the historical events that occurred earlier. Now, that I actually find to be a bit of a problem, because I understand how that works with Gid on Hashem very, very well, because textually there wasn't even a commandment of Gid on Hashem until Sinai. On the other hand, Brit Milah clearly was a commandment given to Avraham and Avraham's children. So it's difficult to understand what the Rambam means. Does the Rambam basically say that Matan Torah superseded all earlier revelations, and you get a reset button, and all commandments are only based on the Sinaitic revelation? But this is the Rambam's idea, that for some reason the Rambam considered this to be extremely important, that all obligations of Jewish people are based on, I don't mean Sinai B'dafka, because there were mitzvot in the Torah given after Sinai, but we mean all mitzvot are based on the Mosaic revelation, the revelation of God to Moshe, whether at Sinai or throughout the 40 years. Now, presumably, the reason why the Rambam felt so strongly about this is this was essentially his philosophical argument with Christianity and Islam. Because remember, both Christianity and Islam, the so-called Abrahamic faiths, they both acknowledge a revelation to Moshe. They believe in the Sinai revelation, the Ten Commandments, everything else, but they believe it was superseded by a later revelation to either Jesus or Muhammad. And as you know, one of the Rambam's 13 fundamental principles is the immutability of the Torah, and that is connected to the supremacy of Moshe Rabbeinu's Nevuah. And as a result, the Rambam was extremely reluctant to allow any other Halakhic influence coming into Judaism other than the Mosaic revelation. So the same argument in which it cannot be superseded by later revelations also means that earlier revelations were indeed superseded. And if we do Brit Milah, it is only because of Matan Torah and not because of what Hashem said to Avram. Now again though, historically, Brit Milah is still different than Gid on Hashem, because Brit Milah was practiced before Matan Torah by Avram's children. Gid on Hashem arguably was in fact not practiced, so it is different. The case of Gid on Hashem is a much clearer, easier example of the Rambam's point than Brit Milah itself. You see?
It's a real kick out of it as well.
I'm sorry, say again, didn't hear you.
It's a real kick out of it.
Okay. Yeah, well, the Gemara itself says that the Gid HaNasheh is a piece of wood, essentially. It has no taste whatsoever. And in fact, therefore, if you cooked meat with the Gid HaNasheh, you'd have to discard the gid hanasheh because it's treif, but it wouldn't make your meat treif because there's no taste that is being absorbed in the gid hanasheh. Yeah.
As far as the bris milah, so in Mitzrayim they were commanded again to give bris milah before the Korban Pesach. So I guess it was in disuse or this.
Yeah, so that's not so. So you're bringing a proof that they weren't. Well,
They weren't real. Maybe they were commanded.
well, the normal understanding is they were commanded, but this is a special mitzvah of Korban Pesach, because.
But if they had all done it, they wouldn't have been commanded.
No, I understand, but remember, most of the Jews were idol worshippers as well. So that's called arum min mitzvot. They were naked from the mitzvahs. Yeah. So this is interesting. So the Rambam writes. Yeah, what about pru or vu, the mitzvah of procreation? So the Rambam actually says the same thing. The reason we have a mitzvah of procreation is not because of what God said to Adam, but because of what God said to Moshe to write down what was said to Adam and Noah. In other words, it's only from the Torah that obligates us, not from the oral command.
But it said, Hashem said.
No, Hashem did say it, but that wouldn't bind us, l'dorot, had Hashem not told Moshe, write this in the Torah. That's what the Rambam's point. Everything is obligatory upon us only because Hashem said, write it in the Torah. So that was the second theological point that the Rambam made. The third point is an interesting debate that's not so, apparently, some of these debates, you wonder why were people so excited over them, but apparently they were because there are quite a few letters about this. And that is being on a boat on Shabbat. Now, this is actually very relevant. People go on cruises sometimes, right? And even if it's a kosher cruise and the like, but you might wind up being on a boat on Shabbos. Now, we are not talking about going on the boat on Shabbos. We're talking about you're on the boat before Shabbos. In fact, it should actually be 3 days before Shabbos. The Gemara actually says you're not supposed to go on a boat 3 days before Shabbos. That means, it's machlokas, is it Thursday, Friday, Shabbos? So you can only go Wednesday, or you can only go Tuesday. And part of that is, in the olden days, actually not so long ago, seasickness was very, very severe. The boats were not as stabilized as today, and as a result, it would take 3 days till you got your sea legs, and we didn't want you to get sick and nauseous over Shabbos, so you have to go on the boat X number of days. Some say Bisman Hazeh that doesn't apply because the ships are much more stabilized. Some people do get severely sick, but most people do not get as sick as they used to get. Some of your parents who may have come over to America by boats, Holocaust or before World War II even, they could vividly describe the seasickness of those times. That's why they would eat these saltine crackers. Apparently that helps for seasickness and the like. But assuming that you're on the boat beheter, what's the problem of being on the boat on Shabbat? So here's the problem. The problem is, Well, get offing it is a problem. But the problem is, even if you're on the boat and you're not getting off the boat, the problem is Techum Shabbos. The law of Techum Shabbos is a very strict law, although in most urban conditions, it's not a major problem. You are not allowed to go on Shabbos. You're not allowed to walk, even without carrying. You're not allowed to walk more than 2,000 amot, which is approximately a kilometer, from your halachically designated place of residence. Now, if you're in the desert and all you have is your hut, it's 2,000 amos from your hut. If you're in a city with continuous houses, so your residence is defined as the city. So how you measure it can be a little complicated, but in most urban areas, you could certainly walk throughout Yerushalayim. That wouldn't be a problem. You could walk to Telstone. There generally would not be a problem. But theoretically, there is an issue called Techum. Now, the laws of Techum are very, very, very severe in the following way. If you step out 1 inch beyond your Techum, you can't just go back and resume your Techum. You are limited to a radius of 4 amos. In other words, for the rest of Shabbos, you're limited to a small circle of 4 amos. Okay, the poskim discuss what if you have to go to the bathroom. Okay, there may be emergency situations and the like, but it's a very, very severe halacha. And when you're out in the country, when you're in non-urban areas, you could very easily violate this because 2,000 amos is not that much, a kilometer. A person could take a walk, and you violated the tichum. So the problem is, you're traveling on a boat. You began Shabbat at point A, and in the course of Shabbat, the boat is moving. You're going beyond the 2,000 amos from your starting point because residence is defined as beginning of Shabbat. So you're not allowed to do that because you're violating the laws of Tichum Shabbat. So the Rambam said this is not a problem. And the reason is because there is a klal in the Gemara that the laws of Tichum do not apply if you are more than 10 tefachim above the ground. A tefach is a fist around 3 or 4 inches. So if you are simply traveling in the air or whatever it would be, the laws of Tichum do not apply if you're more than 10 tefachs above the ground, but the Baghdad rabbinates considered the water to be the ground, and therefore you're not 10 tefachs above the ground, you're on top of the water. The Rambam said if the river is deeper than 10 tefachs, you can keep on traveling indefinitely because there is no Isser of Tichum above 10. Now, again, this is how we paskin, and in a way, this is an obvious psak halacha. But in the time of the Rambam, traveling on boats on Shabbat was a major, major, major issue, and the Rambam was attacked for his lenient position. Now, just as an aside, it's not our subject. You had mentioned getting off a boat, right? Let's imagine, right? You're on a tour, a kosher tour, and by the way, there's all sorts of problems. I mean, okay, this is not a halakha share. I mean. If most of the passengers are Jewish, there's an enormous problem with taking such a tour because essentially you're having non-Jews doing malacha for you on Shabbos. So what you need to do to go on a kosher tour is you need to go on a kosher tour where most of the passengers are non-Jews. So you got to find a kosher tour where most of the passengers are non-Jews, and then the issue of malacha of goyim would not be a big issue because they're doing it for the majority. Okay, be it as it may, though, let's assume you're on a proper kosher tour. Are you allowed to leave the boat on Shabbos? And can you then get back on the boat if you do leave the boat on Shabbos? So there are a lot of questions here. Obviously, if you're leaving the boat and there's no Erev, there are a lot of things you wouldn't be allowed to carry, and that may include a passport and even the identification card to get back on the boat, and you can't just wear it around your neck. So that's one set of issues. But the issue of Tichum, theoretically, might be an issue because as soon as I get off the boat and I hit land, that becomes my residence, and then the boat is going to travel 2,000 amos out. But again, that's not going to be a problem because even if you establish a land-based residence, but as long as the boat is submerged in water that is more than 10 tefach deep, there's not going to be a problem of Tichum. The only problem of Tichum might be if there's going to be a second landing, meaning to say, if we stopped in island number 1 and I descended, so that became my residence, and then we travel more than 2,000 amos and we stop at island number 2, if island number 2 is more than 2,000 amos from island number 1, there would be an Isser of Tichum for me to get off. But as long as I stay on the boat, even if I was on the land and I returned to the boat, there would be no problem of Tichum as long as the water level is 10 tefachs. Right? So again, I don't want to get in too many details. But as I say, this was apparently a very, very controversial issue because even though to Yoseph Iban Jabar, the Rambam is very makatzer, but in other letters of the Rambam that he wrote to the Rosh Yeshiva in Baghdad, there's a whole arichos, again, a lot of halakhic argumentation. Yeah.
The concept of being on a kosher tour and having non-Jews doing the walk on Shabbos for Jews, that would also be the same on a Pesach program on Shabbos. Everybody's Jewish and you have non-Jews non-Jews live more for the Jews.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Now, again, if the Rabbanim are supervising the program, they will have to arrange things in a way that these halachas will be kept. Again, there is a basic principle. Let me emphasize this. The basic principle is that although non-Jews are not in themselves obligated to keep Shabbos or Yom Tov, right? That's clear. A non-Jew can do whatever they want on Shabbos and Yom Tov. In fact, they're not even supposed to keep all the laws of Shabbos and Yom Tov. You are not allowed, you as a Jew, are two things. Not only are you not allowed to ask a guy to do work for you, but even if the guy does it on his own, but he's doing it for your benefit, for a Jew's benefit, you are not allowed to benefit from that malacha. So that creates an enormous complication in cases of Pesach programs, really any hotel program over Shabbos. That creates problems with tours. Now, the general rule is, if malacha is being done for a mixed population, we follow the majority composition of it, which means if the majority are non-Jews, it's going to be okay. But as you say, that's not going to be the case in a Pesach program where almost everybody is going to be Jewish, presumably. So they have to work it out. I mean, again, how they work it out, it can be complicated, but they do have to do it in ways that do not violate this principle. Yeah.
What about the boys working in Israel in hotels?
Huh?
What about all the boys are working in Israel in hotels?
It has to be discussed. It has to be discussed. I mean, it's not just a simple thing. Halachically, it is very, very, very complicated. Yeah.
What about a case like you're in a hotel where the rooms are locked by, push button, and you can't see it because
Yeah. So, I don't want to get into all of the halakhic issues. Let me just say the issue of letting yourself into your room or into the building by an electronic lock. There too, you have the problem of asking a guy, but there the poskim do permit it because they argue that this is simply removal of an impediment that is not called getting benefit. Getting benefit is when they cook for you, they give you something. Here, they're simply removing a negative. So again, you understand that there are going to be subtleties in these types of things. Okay, now the next thing is very, very fascinating, and that is the Rambam is accused. Rabbi Yoseph Iban Jabar says the Rambam is accused of being lenient in the laws of Nida. How could the Rambam be lenient in the laws of Nida? And here the Rambam says, I don't know what you are referring to, but he then suggests what you might be referring to. And this is very fascinating because this is, I had mentioned before, that in the Rambam's time, there was a huge Karaite population in Egypt. The Karaites, the Karaim, were a movement that did not accept the legitimacy of the oral law, and they developed their own practices based on a more literal reading of the Tanakh, of the Chumash. Now, the Karaim are not the same as the Tzdukim. The Tzdukim were a movement of the Second Temple period, and they became largely extinct. The Karaim are from the 8th or 9th century later. But philosophically, you could actually call Karaim neo-Sadducees. I mean, that would be a relatively accurate characterization. Karaim are still around today. They have a synagogue and a chief rabbi, but they're a small movement. In the Rambam's time, however, particularly in Egypt, there were tens of thousands of Karaim, and they posed a major, major threat for Halakhic Judaism. Just as in different times, the Reform movement at one point, although not today, posed a great, great threat to orthodoxy in the United States. Karaim were the reformers of the time, although they were very firm. In their own way, they were very firm. They were very, very strict in their rituals. Now, the Karaim said the following. The Karaim said, when a woman is a Nida, she's not allowed to touch food she's not allowed to sit down on a bench that the husband, well, obviously she can touch her own food, but the Nida cannot make food for her husband. If a Nida sits on a bench, a chair, the husband cannot sit on the bench even when she gets up. Now, these were Karaite interpretations because the Torah does say, any food that she touches becomes tameh. Any bench, any chair on which she sits becomes tameh. The Torah says that. So the Karaites interpreted that to mean verboten, taboo. The Rambam says that is a fundamental misinterpretation of the concept of tuma, and the Karaim are conflating and confusing Iser with tuma. By that I mean the following. The Torah does say when a woman is in a state of Nida, there are prohibitions, right? Husband and wife cannot have marital intercourse. They are even forbidden to affectionately hug and kiss. These are prohibitions. These prohibitions do not go off until the woman counts the requisite 7 clean days and goes to the mikveh. Those are prohibitions. If you violate the laws of Nida, there's a chiyuv kares. These are the laws of Nida. This is called the Isser of Nida. Now, in addition, there's a whole other aspect of Nida that's not about prohibition, but it does create laws of purity and impurity. A Nida touches food, the food is tameh. We'll come back in a moment. A Nida sits on a chair, the chair is tameh. But what does it mean to be tameh? There's no aveira to eat tameh food. There's no aveira to sit on a tameh chair. It just means because it's tameh, it cannot be brought into the Beis HaMikdash until the chair goes to the mikveh. It's not a joke. The chair is immersed. The chair is immersed in the mikveh. So today, we don't pay attention to that. What the Karaim are doing is they're taking the laws of Tuma, which primarily pertain to going into the temple, and they're creating it as a system of taboo and prohibition. And the Rambam says, if that's what you mean, you're in big trouble. Because if you're telling me I'm lenient because I don't follow those particular taboos, those taboos are minos, those taboos are heresy, those taboos are Karaitism. Those taboos are inconsistent with the Torah Shebal Peh, and they confuse 2 different musagim in the laws of Nida. One is the law of prohibition, and the other is the law of Tuma. Now, the law of Tuma today is almost extinct. We don't practice it because all of us are already Tameh. Because we've been in a cemetery, and we don't have the ashes of the Parah Adumah, so we're Tameh. So a Nida is no different than a non-Nida. We're Tameh. So those laws of Tuma are virtually not practiced at all today. But the Karayim were elevating it, and they were assimilating it in the laws of Iser. And they are not Iser, they are just Tuma, and Tuma is connected to the Beis HaMikdash and the like. Okay, that's a very important point just to understand that. It also means, in the time of the Beis HaMikdash, the laws of Nida were much more complicated because there was a whole other extra dimension that you had to consider when you were going to the Beis HaMikdash or a Kohen or the like. So that's one thing that the Rambam says. Now, then the Rambam says, there are other aspects of Karaite practices that permeated Rabbinic Judaism. Because the Rambam said, listen, if you foolishly kept these taboos, although it may be heresy, at least, all you're doing is being machmir. You're going beyond the halacha. That's not necessarily so destructive. But there were other Karaite practices that were actually absolutely against halacha. And he mentioned the Karaite practice based on the verse in Yechezkel that we say during Slichos quite a lot. V'zarakti aleichem mayim tahorim. Remember this famous verse where when God describes forgiveness as, I will sprinkle you with purified water, holy water, pure water. So, instead of going to mikveh, what these women who practiced the Karaite customs was they would have another woman who was not a Nida sprinkle them with water. And based on the verse that this is called waters of purification, they would permit a woman to be with her husband, even without going to a mikveh, but based on zerikat, mayim, zahorim. The Rambam says, chas v'shalom, the woman is a nida until she goes to the mikveh. This is a prohibited practice. And indeed, the Rambam says, the Rambam then speaks locally. We in Cairo, the local rabbinate, the Rabbinical Council of Cairo, we prohibited this practice even if the woman then goes to the mikveh, lest she think that the sprinkling, again, under Torah law, she could be sprinkled and then go to the mikveh. The sprinkling is just useless. But the Rambam says, the rabbis of Cairo, of which he was the leader, we prohibited this practice legamre, lest women will think that the sprinkling has anything to do with it. Also, he points out that the Karaites went to the mikveh bein hashmashot, twilight, meaning they didn't wait until the stars come out. They went to the mikveh sunset of the seventh day, and that is forbidden because a woman cannot go to the mikveh until the emergence of the stars. So he's making the point that any accusation that I am lenient in the laws of mikveh is either because you have incorporated the Karaite chumrot, which make no sense, and then he says, okay, I could tolerate chumrot that make no sense, because at the end of the day, they're just chumrot. But on the other hand, if by incorporating those chumrot, you incorporate leniency, such as being sprinkled with water, or tevilah after shkia, that is absolutely usher. And the Rambam even writes that, once again, the rabbinate in Cairo made a takana that if a woman is widowed and she wants to collect her ketubah, she cannot do so unless she takes an oath, a shavuah, in the name of God, that she did not engage in these Karaite practices. And if she engaged in these Karaite practices, she would not be permitted to collect her ketubah. So she had to swear, b'shem Hashem. Again, this is not a halacha in fact, it's not even a halacha in the Rambam. Such an oath is unknown la halacha per se. But the Rambam spearheaded it as part of his war against Karaites. In fact, one could write a whole article, Dr. Chaim Soloveitchik has written extensively, about how much of the Mishnah Torah is by implication the Rambam's hidden campaign against the Karaites. He has a whole essay, it's a very dense essay. He focuses on Hilchos Shabbos, the Rambam's organization of the laws of Shabbos in the Mishnah Torah. And he points out that it's a very peculiar order. The sequencing of topics in Hilchos Shabbos does not make a lot of sense. And we know that the Rambam, of course, was so expert in organizational sequencing. And he develops the idea, which is a bit of a dense idea, that the sequencing was designed to address Karaite heresies, even though the Rambam didn't mention what those heresies were. So, but this is an example about these laws of Nida. Yeah?
If today we don't fix the English, so Kohanim are telling me anyway without the secretary, if they take food from their wife, if they take a bachelor, if they take something. So why is it that they can't go to the cemetery? Because they're already
Yeah. So this is very interesting. The Ravid, Rav Avram ben David, actually says exactly what you're saying. The Ravid has a tremendous chiddush that a Kohen Bisman Hazeh is allowed to go to a cemetery because he's already Tameh anyway. So once you're Tameh, you don't become more Tameh. So the Ravid does allow it. However, I have to add right away, the halacha is not like the Ravid. And we do paskin that even if you're Tameh, you're not allowed to add an extra Tumah. A Kohen cannot add an extra Tumah on top of Tumah. Now again, though, let me emphasize that the prohibition of becoming Tameh is only on a Kohen, meaning all of us who are Tameh cannot go into the Beis Hamikdash. That's true. But there's no prohibition in our becoming Tameh. Only a Kohen is prohibited to become Tameh. And the only Tumah is the Tumah of a dead body, meaning a Kohen can become Tameh through a dead animal or any other way, although it'll still restrict him to go to the temple, but there's no Aveira unless it is Tumas Mes. Yeah.
What does washing one's hands do that you can understand?
Yeah, so washing hands does nothing whatsoever for the laws of Tuma. If I'm in a cemetery, if I'm under the roof with a corpse, my whole body is Tameh. And the only way I can become Tahor from that Tuma is the ashes of the Para Aduma, which Bichlal we don't have, and going to the mikveh full body. Washing hands does not in any way take off the laws of Tuma. What it does is it takes off more of a Kabbalistic idea called Ruach Ra'ah. There are like evil spirits, Kabbalistically, that attach themselves to you and they hang around your fingernails. And as a result, through the ritual of Netilat Yadayim, the Ruach Ra'ah is nistalek, but that is a Kabbalistic notion. In terms of, so colloquially, we might say, you're not Tameh. But the truth is you are Tameh. Legabe, the laws of Tuma as a Halakhic construct, washing hands does not do a thing. And in fact, even mikveh wouldn't do anything because of Para Aduma. See, for tumas like Nida, you don't need Para Aduma. So that's why a Nida who goes to the mikveh in the proper time is Tahor from the Tuma of Nida, but she, like all of us, would still have the Tuma of Met, any contact with a dead body that she might have had. Okay, there'll be more halachic issues. Again, as I say, the Rambam is addressing them in bullet points, but I think the Karaite issue was an interesting one because it does indicate how pervasive some of the Karaite practices were, even among what you might call halachically observant Jews. Yeah.
Actually, based on that last comment, were there historically, would Karaites ever return to rabbinic Judaism, and was there a process that people would, was that a conversion type?
In other words, would you convert to Karaitism?
No, somebody wanted, a Karaite wanted to.
Okay, yeah. So again, these are one of the things that change with time. But generally speaking, the Rambam's own view, and the Rambam was familiar with this community, is halachically they were Jews. They were Jewish people. They did not need a halachic conversion, but technically they were heretics because they denied the oral law. But the Rambam then says that the stigma of heresy only applies to the first generation that was familiar with rabbinic Judaism and rejected it. With respect to the later generations that grew up that way, they are like a tinok shenishba, they are like a kidnapped baby, and although they have heretical beliefs, we should love them and we should try to draw them near to the Torah and mitzvos. By the way, that passage in the Rambam is very, very relevant to how we deal with secular Jews today, that we consider them our brothers and sisters, and we relate to them with love. But in terms of conversion, the Rambam considered them Jewish. Now, you have to understand that you cannot take a 11th century ruling and apply it today. No, in the course of the centuries, different things happen, and different types of marriages are arranged. So as a result, Bisman Hazeh, unless a person can show a definite line of descent, we probably would require a Karaite to convert to Halakhic Judaism. In other words, these things change. You can't just pull out what the Rambam said, in the 1000s. Okay, be well, have a good week.